We're doing kind of a telling the other side of the story, I guess you could say, because the governor is going to be giving his state of the state. I gave the state of 10% of the state, Cuyahoga County, a few days ago, but the governor is going to be giving his state of the state in a few days. We're going to be keeping a pretty busy itinerary, kind of telling the other side of the story. So we'll wait and see what the governor says, but we have a different view of how Ohio is doing and what the priorities of the state should be. A great example of that, to me, is the legislature, of course, just passed some rules restricting voting rights, and apparently the governor's staff has indicated his intention to sign that. And to me, it's another example of misplaced priorities. There's over 400,000 people out of work in Ohio. We're 45th in the country in job creation recently. That's what the focus should be on. And again, I think that what should be the agenda of the state has been hijacked in a lot of ways by an extreme ideology that sometimes the governor is part of, sometimes he goes along with it, sometimes it's not quite clear. But there have been a lot of consequences to his policies through the last few years, and I don't think we're going to probably hear that. But we're going to have a couple stops on our trip in the next few days that I think are going to point out some of the differences. So we're going to be speaking actually at outside of a educational facility in Medina where his speech is being given, talking about what the implications have been of his cuts of over $500 million net in K through 12 education. We're going to be I'll be meeting with workers from Ormet for the second time. Again, the governor was actually recently asked about that again, and he's decided that's a political issue. Well, for the people that lost their jobs down there, they just view it as a issue of survival, economic survival, not politics. So that's something I think a governor has a responsibility to do. I've said that before. And one of the points I'm going to make over the next couple of days is there's a certain version of reality that the governor is going to give. And I think he has that view because he's not in touch with the actual reality that most people in Ohio are living with. That's why he feels comfortable using the language that he has, that the economy in Ohio is a miracle. Now, in my state, or in my county, unemployment rate is below the national average and it's below the state average. But I've never described it as a miracle because if you're in touch with people and you know how many people are struggling, you just don't use that kind of language. But I think it's a good example of how we view what's happened in Ohio in the last few years differently. So I wanted to be brief and get to anything that's on your mind and have a few minutes to talk about it. I think we have a half an hour or so.
Ed, could you, just to continue on your last thought there, the Quinnipiac poll that came out earlier this week kind of backed you up on that. 47% of the voters said that they don't think that the governor can relate to their problems. But yet 51% of the voters approve of his job performance. Why is there a disconnect there?
Well, I don't get too much into the weeds, I think, of polling questions because they can get skewed very easily depending on how a polling question is asked and the order that it's asked in. I do think that one of the most basic things that a public official can do is relate to regular people and have policies that the average person in Ohio feels are supportive of them, and that's where he's been dropping the ball. Look, you go back to 2010, and you have John Kasich telling people he's going to cut their taxes. Now, he did cut income taxes, but he never told people that he was going to finance it. And back in 2010, never told people he was going to finance it by cuts to K through 12 education, cuts to local government fund, or increasing their sales taxes. And so when people start to feel the effects of those things, they start saying, okay, I liked what I heard before, but now you have basically what I would call buyer's remorse. You have people saying, now that I've seen that most of the benefits are going to a very small group of people, I don't feel like his policies are on my side. And that's just a really fundamental question that every voter asks themselves before they go in the voting booth. And I do think it's reflected in the poll, not just that the answer to that poll, or that polling question, but the fact that he's consistently been in the low 40s over and over again. I mean, there's been some polls I was ahead of him in one poll. Polls go up and down, they're going to keep going up and down. But he's consistently in the low 40s, and I think the reason is because when you get elected to office, in the first year or so, people make a judgment about whether you kind of have their back or whether you don't. And I think his first year in office, it was real clear what his priorities were. I think he's going to try to shuffle them a little bit right before the election, but I think there's a pretty strong impression of what he's all about.
So to follow up on that, Ed, on the Q poll results, there were some good numbers in there for the governor. There are some good numbers in there for you as well. You're only 5 points behind, but 78% of the folks that they talk to really don't know who you are. 46% of the folks said that he deserves to be reelected again, but only 42% said he doesn't. So that's below 50. Now that Charlie Earl's on the ballot, is that a good thing for you?
I think it's a good thing for Charlie Earl. I mean, look, I think I could beat the governor if it was one-on-one. I think I could beat him in a three-way race. The polls indicate that I've seen. I think Mr. Earl tends to average around 6% of the vote. Mm-hmm. He is a conservative. He is a fiscal conservative. He's more consistently fiscally conservative than Governor Kasich is. And he polls fairly well among some people that agree with the kind of Tea Party fiscal conservative views. I'll let other people figure out who that's going to help or who it's not going to help. I'll tell you in terms of the governor's numbers. Let me put it this way: I've seen my own numbers in my own county, which is about 10% of the state. If my reelection number against any opponent was 43%. I wouldn't have a lot of confidence. My reelection number when we did polling before I ever got in this race was over 60%. And again, I think the reason is when you come into office, people give you a chance to see what you're all about. You have a honeymoon period for about a year, and you say, what does this person stand for? And that's when they make their decision. And that kind of frames usually the rest of your term in office. In the governor's first year was characterized by Senate Bill 5, first and foremost, cuts to a local government fund, which led to a lot of tax increases, and cuts to education. And that is an overwhelming impression that people still have in their minds. I would rather be at 38% and have of the vote right now and have most people not know who I am yet than have the vast majority of people know who I am, like they know Governor Kasich, and most of them saying we don't want him anymore. That's why when I said the other day he's going to need all the money he's raised is because people have had an opportunity to sample this product and they're lining up in the return aisle. And I don't think that's a good sign for him. Doesn't mean the election's over, but it means it's going to be a very competitive election.
And many times you've been critical, obviously, of the governor's cuts. That's how he paid for his tax decreases. Sometimes people will say, well, it's easy to criticize from the sidelines. You weren't there. You didn't have to balance that budget 3 years ago. What would you have done differently that first time around? Would you have made fewer cuts, kept taxes the same, increased taxes, or delayed tax cuts?
Darrell, you said that he funded the decreases by cuts, but he also funded the decreases by increases. And that I would not have done. And that's what I said. So, sometimes that gets glossed over. And the governor certainly tries to gloss over it. But here's what...
I'm sorry.
I'm talking about the second budget, certainly.
In the sales tax.
In the sales tax increase. Right. Look, if you're on a fixed income, you did not get a tax cut. Period. And if you're making, let's say, $30,000 a year, you got a net tax increase. I know the governor likes to gloss over it, but that's fact. So if you're at the top end of the income scale, you could get as much as a $6,000, a little bit more than the $6,000 net tax cut because you made enough income to make up for the sales tax increase. But if you didn't make enough income in the first place and you're really struggling to make it, that means you got a net tax increase. Now, here's the other thing that they've really tried to gloss over. But trust me, local communities are well aware of it. As you probably know, I spoke to the Ohio Township Trustee Association the other day, and when Senator Faber was talking about how their budgets are doing better than ever and they have record surpluses, I've never seen an audience with as many people shaking their head no in my life. I mean, the fact is, from just a fiscally responsible, fiscally conservative vantage point, the state budget, you talked about the cuts that have been made, it's bigger than it's ever been. The state budget is bigger than it's ever been. Talk to local elected officials and see how many of them have budgets that are bigger than they've ever been before. You'd be hard-pressed to find a lot that are in that category. So state government has grown. They take more local money than they used to, which I don't believe was theirs to take, because there was a long-standing agreement about how that money was supposed to be divided. And I don't consider that to be fiscally responsible or fiscally conservative to take more money out of local communities, grow your budget, and then use some of those cuts on top of it to fund tax cuts for the wealthiest people in the state. Now, what I would say to you is, what I think is my responsibility is to say, what are my budgetary priorities in general? And you can look at my record. When I became mayor of my city of Lakewood, we had terrible financial problems. There were a lot of calls to raise taxes to try to make up the difference, and we didn't. We dramatically cut the size of city government. Now, we did not give a bunch of handouts to the richest people in my city and raise taxes on the poorest people in my city. We actually put some of the savings into services that helped everybody, including economic development, housing enforcement, law enforcement. Same thing at the county. There were calls to raise taxes as soon as I got in. We dramatically cut the payroll. We actually returned more money to local communities. And we put money into services like job creation, law enforcement, early childhood education. Those would be my priorities. They have been my priorities, and they would be if I was governor.
But spending does go up in your budget, in your Cuyahoga County budget now, I believe.
It's gone up from the second budget compared to the first budget.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
But let me just point out this, is that the payroll did not. So we made investments into things, let's say like, for instance, infrastructure. We did a lot more infrastructure spending. We didn't pass the bill down to local communities to do that. We did about $60 million worth of infrastructure spending. And we have about 53% of our general operating budget in reserve. That's an almost unheard of number. Anybody that knows government finance knows it. You should have 10%. 20% is good. 25% is really good. Now, we signed an ordinance saying that we have to keep at least 25% in reserve, and we've exceeded that by twice the amount. So I think it's been very fiscally responsible.
Not to belabor, but if you criticize Kasich for that, I mean, what would you have done differently? To that budget, would you have? You obviously would not have increased taxes. Could you have balanced the budget without a tax increase? Do you think?
Yeah, because I've done it repeatedly, and to me as a candidate for governor, my job is to explain to people what are my priorities. It's the same thing that Governor Kasich talked about, not very accurately, by the way, in 2010. He said he was going to balance the budget. He said he was going to cut taxes at the same time. Very light on the details. If he had told people that he was going to balance the budget by just passing all the pain down to school districts and communities, I don't think we'd be having this conversation right now, because I don't think he would have won. If he had told people he was going to cut taxes by raising everybody's sales taxes, I think we might be having a different conversation right now. I've managed to balance budgets without doing those things, by making government more efficient. I think state government can be still more efficient than it is right now. And my priority would not be with some of the tax cuts that I think are overly weighted towards the wealthiest people in the state. I think that is just a failed economic theory that Governor Kasich believes in. There's a lot of other people across the country that believe in it. I don't think it works. And the proof is in the pudding, because it isn't working in this state. Where is the evidence that the tax cuts that overwhelmingly benefited the wealthiest people in the state have been working in terms of job creation? If we're 45th in the country in job creation. There's been virtually no job creation except for the first year of the Kasich administration, when Governor Strickland's policies were still largely in effect. The more time there has been to have his policies, whether it's budgetary policies, education policies, or tax policies in effect, the worse the economy has done. Yes?
You were talking about the size of state government being bigger than ever.
The budget is.
The budget. That is largely attributed to the fact that they're expanding Medicaid, and that Medicaid continues to grow. So, I mean, are you saying that the budget should be shrunk, that it should be reduced? So how would you do that?
I'm saying I don't think he's been consistent in terms of what he promised and what he's delivered. He certainly, when he was running, wasn't saying that he was going to be submitting the largest budgets in the history of the state. He certainly gave people the impression that the budget was going to get smaller. Now, what we've done in Cuyahoga County is we've taken a function by function and department by department really data-based, performance-based approach in terms of how do you shrink the size of government, and it has worked. So, for instance, and we call the process county stat at the county level, and I would implement the same kind of system at the state level. I did it as a mayor, and we called it city stat at the city level. And basically, what it means is you take every single function of government, and you say, what are the inputs, what are the outputs, what are the best practices in every single area, and how do you figure out a way to be more efficient? Sometimes you find out you have to spend more in a certain area than you should. And then other areas you find out that there's efficiencies. So if you take my county, for example, we took the auditor's office and we ended up shrinking it by about 50%. But when we looked at law enforcement, we said we actually don't have enough resources in law enforcement, and we actually hired more sheriff's deputies. We're one of the few, maybe the only county in the state where we significantly increased the number of sheriff's deputies that we have out on the street. So it allows you to make rational decisions. And you can't exactly predict with absolute precision where those cuts are going to be made, but there are efficiencies. That's the way to efficiently run an organization. And I don't think Governor Kasich knows how to do that. He didn't have a record of ever managing an organization. He was in Congress. He worked for Lehman Brothers, which was not exactly a raving success. And now he's running this large bureaucracy, and I haven't seen signs that it's being done particularly efficiently.
So would the state budget continue to grow in a FitzGerald administration? Or no?
Well, I mean, the challenge is to try to make sure that your overhead on a day-to-day basis in terms of how you do the services that you want to get done, if that's done as efficiently as possible. It's going to be a compromise process between myself and the legislature. There might be some areas, again, that we spend less. There might be some where we end up spending more. I want to make more of an investment, for instance, in early childhood education. Again, to me, I want to avoid what I call budgeting for dummies, where somebody says, well, I'm going to cut 5% across the board no matter what. You make rational decisions about what your priorities are. And my responsibility, I think, as a candidate, is to say these are what my priorities are. And these are where I think the governor's priorities are misplaced. I think to put his number one priority, as far as I can tell, his number one priority is to give tax cuts that are overwhelmingly weighted to the people that have already done exceptionally well in the state. And that has been at the cost, I think, for things that we should be making investments in, like early childhood education, where there's other states in the country that are making significant investments and we're not.
And Mayor Coleman, in the State of the City Wednesday night, spent a portion of his speech talking about how important a national convention would be to the economy of Central Ohio. And in speaking to experienced Columbus officials, they believe it could generate $150 million for Columbus. You seemingly have endorsed a convention in your neck of the woods in Cleveland. Can you talk about that and the money being spent to try to lure a convention there? And have you spoken to Mayor Coleman about his efforts in Columbus to try to get a convention here?
Sure. I mean, there should be a convention in Ohio. And, you know, my first choice is our hometown. We put together a coalition of folks between Mayor Jackson and myself in Cleveland. Folks from the Democratic and the Republican Party actually have sat in on meetings with us. I think it was the only meeting I was in with Matt Borges where he didn't say anything critical of me, so that was nice. And Bob Bennett was there. We brought in a lot of people from the corporate community up there as well. We're going to have something pending in front of both Cleveland City Council and County Council coming up, where we're going to be asking them to commit, I think it's about $2.5 million as kind of our share of what a bid process might take. We've gotten very strong commitments from the corporate community up there. I had some conversations a long time ago with Mayor Coleman about this. I haven't in recent weeks about it. Look, if Cleveland doesn't get one of the conventions, I hope Columbus does. I think it would be great for the state if one of us had one convention and the other one had the other convention. You know, I had a chance to go down to Charlotte in 2012, not just for the Democratic convention, which I did, but we also did a little scouting way back then and talked to some of the corporate folks. And what the people in Charlotte told us, and these were folks from the business community and their Chamber of Commerce, was that you know, it wasn't just that you had an influx of dollars, because it's basically the biggest convention in the country, but it's a way to showcase your community. And Columbus has some great stories to tell about the improvements that have been made here. It's a beautiful city, and it's made great progress. I mean, I went to school here. I finished up at Ohio State in 1990, and it's just changed. I mean, even the difference that I see now that I'm spending quite a bit of time down here, you've made a tremendous amount of progress. We're very proud about the progress we've made in Cleveland. And I think for the whole state, it's an opportunity for us to get on the national and even a little bit of the international stage and change some people's minds about what Ohio is all about. So I think it's great that we have 2, maybe 3. Cincinnati's looking at it too. I'm not clear on how far along they are. I don't think they're as far along right now as Columbus and Cleveland are. But we ought to be well poised for one of the major conventions to come to one of those cities. And if it doesn't happen to be Cleveland, I'll be 100% supportive of someplace else in Ohio.
I have another budget question. It seems like you're saying that it's fiscally responsible what you've done up in Cleveland with the 25% reserve. But I know that members of your party have been very critical that the Republicans are holding back money in the state level rainy day fund. I mean, how do you view what you would put aside as governor? Would you do something differently in the rainy day fund? And aren't they also being fiscally responsible, putting something aside?
Well, number one is they haven't just been holding the money aside, they've also been turning it into tax cuts. And so even every time there's any kind of windfall for the state, so for instance, when the news came out, or the specifics were coming out in terms of how much additional revenue the state was going to realize because of Medicaid expansion, immediately the suggestion was, and I think it was $400 million or so, immediately the suggestion was, oh good, well now we can do another tax cut. Even though the estimate was that if you're a middle class family, that the result of the tax cut would basically be you could buy a slice of pizza and you get over $1,000 if you're at the top end of the income scale. So to me, the way that I've read the critiques is there's nothing wrong with having a strong rainy day fund. You should, and we have one that's much stronger than the state's is. The problem is when you finance that basically by rating other communities' rainy day funds. That's what really is galling, not just, by the way, to Democratic officials, but to local elected officials in general. When I was speaking to the township trustees, that's not really a partisan issue for them because they view the local government fund as funds that the state collected, yes, because the state is the tax collector, but those were not supposed to be exclusively state funds. When those taxes were levied in the first place, there was an explicit agreement. It was a bipartisan agreement with Democratic governors and Republican governors and Democratic legislatures and Republican legislatures that money was supposed to be held in trust for local communities to draw down on when they needed it. So what happened? Well, when they needed it the most, it disappears. So that's what the dialogue has been. It's what's been galling to local communities isn't just that the rainy day is being built up, the fund is being built up, that's a good thing. It's that they're also handing out favors and tax cuts to a very select group of folks while taking resources away that were really meant to be spent on K-12 education or local government services. And by the way, the governor and some of his friends have characterized the local government fund as if that's some kind of a giveaway or welfare for communities. The taxes that were levied in the first place, whether it was the state sales tax back in the 30s or the state income tax back in the early 70s, there was an explicit agreement. I'm not talking about a behind the scenes handshake. I'm talking about an explicit deal. These taxes are going to go up, but the state's not going to keep all the money. And that's the agreement that I think the governor ran away from. And I don't think it's fiscally responsible. I've never balanced a budget that way, and that's what I hear over and over again from local elected officials. They say, we don't have the option to balance our budget by just taking money away from another entity and then saying, so sorry that you had to raise your taxes as a result. It's passing the buck.
And back to the political side of this.
Yeah.
What do you know of Larry Ely, and how do you plan to deal with him as the campaign goes on? Would you be willing to debate him before the primary?
I don't know much about him. I met him once, I think. And I said hello to him, and that's basically the extent of it.
What was the scenario in which you met him?
I think it was in Dayton. I don't remember what event it was at Dayton. He just said he said hi, and he was going to run for governor, and I said, okay, and I said, I'm not going to sign your petition, but that was about it. I mean, he was very cordial, and that's about it. I haven't followed it. I haven't followed his career that closely.
Is he your opponent at this point, or is John Kasich your opponent?
Well, I think John Kasich is our opponent. I mean, that's what I'm focusing on.
Do you plan to file a lawsuit if Kasich signs these election bills, and what would the basis be?
Well, we very well might. And I directed my law director to review the legislation and look at the applicable voting rights statutes and see if we have any legal recourse. And so he's reviewing that. That's right. And we've done that before. We are the only county in Ohio, and I'm very proud of this, we are the only county in Ohio that when they tried to change the election rules at the last minute in 2012, of course there was a lawsuit over that, and there's only one county in Ohio that filed an amicus brief that we filed in federal court. And sometimes, for those of you that are lawyers, are there any lawyers here besides me? Unfriendly crowd. Sometimes you wonder in a big federal case if an amicus brief is even, an amicus brief is a friend of the court brief, and it doesn't mean you're a party to the lawsuit, but it means that you have something to say about a lawsuit. You can file it on either side of the contest. And we filed on behalf of the people that were challenging those last-minute restrictions. And sometimes you wonder if, in a big, complicated piece of litigation, if the judges actually read amicus briefs. But we know they did because they actually cited our amicus brief as one of the reasons that the Sixth Circuit threw out those voting restrictions. That wasn't the first time that we've on the official side, we've felt that it was appropriate to get involved in these kinds of questions. Back in 2011, when Secretary of State Husted was trying to prevent local boards of elections from sending out vote-by-mail applications, we disagreed very strongly with that, spoke out about it very strongly, and as you probably know, my office ended up appropriating money through our county council to do that independently of our Board of Elections, which Secretary Husted took issue with, and then we ended up meeting and negotiating a compromise which did not allow for the mailing out of absentee ballot applications in 2011, but it did in 2012, not just in Cuyahoga County, but statewide, which I think was a big step forward in voter access, and I'm proud to have been a part of that. I think it was an example of standing up for doing the right thing on behalf of voters and getting a good result for the whole state. So we're going to look at doing it again, because these restrictions, which I think are outrageous and unnecessary and totally motivated by a desire to make it tougher to vote. I don't think there's any, I don't make any bones about it. I think it's voter suppression. It's clear and simple. It's part of a nationwide agenda and set of tactics that's being used in state after state after state, all with the same goal to try to make it tougher to vote. And that is not in the interest of the residents of Cuyahoga County. When it's been tough to vote, like it was back, let's say, in the 2004 presidential election, that affected places like Cuyahoga County and Columbus and Cincinnati, big urban centers in particular. And I think the legislature, I think Governor Kasich knows that. I think that's why they passed House Bill 194 way back when. I think that's why the governor signed it back then. So I think it's politically motivated. It's not in the best interest of voters. We ought to be looking at ways to make it easier to vote. We ought to be looking at ways to make the exercising your franchise more accessible, not less accessible. And they ought to be ashamed of themselves for every single session of the legislature trying to figure out a way to chip away at it. And the governor ought to just do the right thing and veto it. Say, look, go back to work focusing on creating jobs. Stop wasting our time trying to figure out ways to change the rules. This is the second time in recent months they try to change the rules to make it tougher for libertarians or independent candidates to get on the ballot. They have the gall to do that right in the middle of the election season and then have that thrown out by federal court. So they've got a really sorry history when it comes to this, and this is just the latest chapter.
When you're talking about restrictions, are you focused on the absentee ballot applications specifically, and who can mail them, or is there something
I think
else?
that's part of it, but I think restricting the date, the so-called golden week or golden days of voting is another aspect of it. I don't know what problem this is allegedly solving. I think Secretary Houston has basically said that voter fraud is not a particular issue in this state. And so I'm not sure what they're solving. Actually, I think I know what they're solving. What they're solving is they want to try to make it tougher for certain folks to vote in this state, and everybody sees through it. Everybody sees through it. Nobody's fooled by this.
Do you support online voter registration?
I do. If it can be done in a way, that totally guarantees, the veracity of the information. I mean, you have to have a very robust system to make sure that can happen. But I think is it technologically possible? Yes, I'd like to see something like that at some point.
Can you tell us why the campaign decided not to challenge the abortion provisions in the budget, either legally or through the lengthy referendum process you described last
Well,
time?
I think we challenged it in terms of, we certainly challenged whether it should be done, because we came out and said that if I were governor, I would have vetoed each and every one of them. On the referendum part of it, well, let me back up. Let me answer it this way, Joe. That was not going to be an endeavor that the campaign was going to be able to do unilaterally, and I said that at the time. I said there's a whole coalition of folks who are in vehement disagreement with these restrictions on women's health care and the decisions that women are allowed to make in the state when it comes to their health care. And I said I am interested in challenging that, possibly in court, certainly through the election, and possibly with a referendum. But that's an enormous undertaking. And there were estimates that if that was going to go on the ballot, it would require an entire separate campaign that might take as much as 20, 30, some estimates were $40 million in order to fund that. And I think a decision was just made, and it wasn't my decision to make unilaterally. I would have liked to have seen it challenged, but that's something where you've got to build the coalition for it. And I think when you're trying to take on an incumbent governor and everything that is entailed with that, we chose to, and I say collectively, I think people that have been advocates on that issue decided that was too much to take on and take on an incumbent governor at the same time.
Can you talk about ways you might want to try to improve education?
Sure. My big focus since I've been in office has always been early childhood education. The studies have shown that there's sometimes as much as a 17-to-1 basically return on investment for money that is invested in early childhood education. So we try to do that a couple different ways in my county. And by the way, my county really, like most county governments, really hadn't been that big of a participant in education at all. And I'm not required by my charter to be involved in early childhood education. But we thought it made sense. It didn't just make sense in terms of education policy, but we also think it's in the best interest economically of the residents of my part of the state and the entire state. So we've done a few things that I'd like to see duplicated at the state level. Number one is we took some of the savings that we got for making government more efficient, and we invested more money into early childhood education. So I'm talking about pre-kindergarten. The research shows that there's this enormous gap in terms of students' readiness when they first start kindergarten. So you'll have kids that start kindergarten with a 500-word vocabulary, and you'll have kids that will start kindergarten with a 4,000-word vocabulary. And that gap, that difference, doesn't just happen. It's usually because of interactions and involvement with a child before they get to kindergarten. But that gap generally persists through the child's entire academic career. And there are programs that have been proven to work to address that imbalance so that when kids start kindergarten, they're ready to start to learn. So we put more money into that. We've also taken on part of the burden of funding universal pre-kindergarten. So each year in every one of my budgets, I've increased funding for early childhood education and universal pre-kindergarten. Now on top of that, we also set up the first program of its kind in the country where every single child starting this school year, every single child in my county that starts kindergarten has a college savings account that we set up in their name. We put a deposit into the account. We hold it in trust for them until they graduate from high school, and then they can use it for vocational education or a 2-year college or a 4-year college. And again, what the research shows is that a child that has a savings account, regardless of income, is overwhelmingly more likely to understand the value of education, that they have a future, that their future is going to be in having an education that goes past high school, and they start thinking about that very early. It increases financial literacy for the family, and I'm just very, very proud that very economically, the whole program is less than $3 million for 10% of the state. And we were able to do that for every single child that's starting kindergarten in Cuyahoga County. That's every single public school child, private school child, homeschool, suburban, urban, everybody. And I think that's an important universal value that I'd like to see the state adopt as well.
And I want to ask if you can just be clear on one thing.
Sure.
When we were talking about the budget, under an Ed FitzGerald governor, would you be able to do what you want to do without raising taxes?
The answer is yes. If we can align our priorities the right way, I think that is possible. And I've been through this before. When I ran for mayor, when I ran for county office, I would always make the same statements that there were certain initiatives that I wanted to do, but I thought the government could be more efficient. I thought we could align our priorities, and I still say that. And I was able to do that. And my default position is always to try to avoid a tax increase. And I've managed to do that, again, in balancing my budgets. I never have submitted a budget to either my council or to my county council that relied on an increase in taxes. And so that's my default position as somebody that's been fiscally responsible and fiscally conservative. The governor campaigns as a fiscal conservative, doesn't tell people he was going to raise taxes, and then did. And I think people can count on me to not take that approach.
So your Cuyahoga County budget doesn't have your budget.
The budget that I submitted, because there was a levy that was on the ballot. The budget that I submitted balanced the budget without taking into account whether or not the human service levy increase was defeated, whatever the case may be.
But would you undo Governor Kasich's the income tax cuts that you say are unfair?
Now, what Governor Kasich is trying to do is and his team is trying to do, which you're repeating, is he's trying to say that if I think that his priorities were misplaced, that means that when I get there, in order to fix it, there's going to be a tax increase. That's not what my position is. My position is that his tax policies have been overwhelmingly weighted to the wealthiest people in the state, and I think that was a mistake. And I